Despite yesterday's tumultuous day in Washington, Congress still managed to perform its constitutional duty. It officially affirmed Joe Biden as the next president of the United States. Vice President Mike Pence confirmed Mr. Biden's win just before 4 a.m. Eastern Time. The work was delayed hours because of the violence on Capitol Hill. CBS News chief congressional correspondent Nancy Cordes has more on the unpredictable path it took to get there.
The chair declares the joint session dissolved.
It was the culmination of a day of chaos, capped by Vice President Mike Pence rejecting President Trump's false claim that he could overturn the Electoral College. He recorded President-elect Joe Biden's win just before 4 a.m.
Joseph R. Biden, Jr. of the state of Delaware has received 306 votes. Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida has received 232 votes. The Senate will come to order.
That concluded Pence's duties presiding over a joint session of Congress both before and after an hours-long siege of the Capitol by President Trump's supporters.
The world will again witness the resilience and strength of our democracy. For even in the wake of unprecedented violence and vandalism at this Capitol,
lawmakers on both sides tried their best to seal President-elect Biden's win on the day called for in the Constitution, January 6th. But they were thwarted by a violent wave of protesters in the halls of Congress and later by Republicans in the House and Senate. Missouri Senator Josh Hawley and dozens of House members pushing to throw out the electoral votes from Pennsylvania. There were defections from the cause. Georgia Senator Kelly Loeffler decided not to challenge her state's results a day after losing her own bid for re-election.
And I cannot now in good conscience object to the certification of these electors.
A series of top Republicans condemned not only the day's violence, but the president's role in stoking it.
What happened here today was an insurrection incited by the President of the United States.
Some of the strongest rebukes of the night came from one of President Trump's most loyal defenders.
I hate it to end this way. Oh, my God, I hate it. From my point of view, he's been a consequential president. But today, first thing you'll see, all I can say is count me out. Enough is enough.
Nancy Cordes, CBS News, Capitol Hill.
For more on this, let's bring in John Dickerson. He is CBS News' senior political analyst and a 60 Minutes correspondent. John, welcome. It's so great to have you with us. You have covered Washington for many, many years. Help us make sense of what transpired yesterday. What is the best and most honest way we can describe it?
It's a great question. It's very hard to make sense of what happened yesterday because there are no examples to look at in history. But in another way, it's very easy to see what happened yesterday. The president's remarks over the last several months saying that falsely claiming that the election was stolen have stirred up his supporters. He called them to Washington. When they got there, the president, his son, Rudy Giuliani, amped them up and said, go to the Capitol. And the result was what we all saw. But there was a larger path that has created the conditions here, which is over 4 years of challenging the very nature of truth and of being essentially enabled by many of his supporters in Congress. The president was given a lot of room to move. And when you're given that much room to move, this kind of thing can happen.
So, many people seeing these images say, boy, this is a fraying of American democracy I thought I might never see in my lifetime. So from a political standpoint, have we sort of hit a rock bottom? Is there anything that might change for the better as a result of what happened?
Well, you can look at it glass half full, glass half empty. I mean, the glass looks pretty empty when you see those images, and you realize that what is under attack here is the basic bedrock of the American system, which is we fight our political disagreements at the ballot box in order to not fight in the streets. And that underlying the contest at the ballot box is the idea that everybody's going to abide by the results. That's the basic promise of American democracy. And so that's being threatened. So in a sense, the basic heart of American democracy is being threatened. However, you can look at the glass half full and say election workers all over the country did their job, followed the rules, counted the votes, and Americans turned out in record numbers in the middle of a pandemic. The courts looked at these charges, threw most of them out, almost all of them out, and the courts did their job. And then, as ugly as yesterday was, the Capitol Police cleared the place, and Congress did its job. So the test was, this was a stress test of democracy, but democracy succeeded in the end. As ugly as the test was, and nobody would like to go through this again, the glass half full way of looking at it is that American democracy prevailed against this test.
Right. But I guess what's dispiriting to hear you talk about that is that this was such a secure election and it was so successful in so many ways, and yet so many people still walked away thinking the opposite, that it was not. You know, what if we have an election in the future that does have some more, widespread irregularities? It makes you wonder how much we can sustain.
The question at the heart of this current moment is whether facts and reason and tradition matter in American public life. If you don't have those things, you can't have a conversation about how to fix healthcare, how to fix infrastructure, immigration. The president challenged all three of those, and his party went along with a lot of it because he delivered for his party. The problem is that it creates this kind of chaos. And so the test for America going forward is whether, because when you talk about millions of people believing that the election was fraudulent, they believe that because the president told them, and nobody in his party until yesterday stood up and said, that's a lie, Mr. President, because they were afraid of his power in the base of their party. And they were right to be afraid, because we saw yesterday the president's power, what it can do when it encourages his supporters to take things into their own hands. So we are now at a moment where some of this can be reset, and where lies in the public square can be called out as lies so that they don't lead to this kind of an outcome in the future. So there's a lot in American democracy to rely on, but the participants in it have to rely on those things. We'll see if they do.
Absolutely. And John, I want to ask you about the 25th Amendment. This is not something to be taken lightly. CBS News has learned that Trump cabinet secretaries are discussing invoking the 25th Amendment to perhaps remove President Trump from office. We should note, of course, nothing formal has been presented to the vice president. But what should we make of this? Is this just talk or a viable option?
Well, I don't have the reporting on where things stand with respect to whether it's just talk or a viable option. It is a very serious option. Obviously, things got extremely serious yesterday, and we saw even before yesterday that 10 former secretaries of defense wrote an extraordinary op-ed in the Washington Post reminding everybody of the military's role in American elections. And so we are at a moment where people are concerned, and the question is, will the president, with the last 13 days and this still very durable relationship with his supporters, who he is continuing to tell the lie that the election was stolen, should that be severed? Is there enough of an emergency in 13 days that should be severed? And we'll just have to see if that's the conclusion that they draw. Because you could imagine this, it's not simple doing the 25th Amendment route. It's never, Section 4 has never been used before. It would be an extraordinary thing to do, and it would not be without its own kind of consequences and blowback.
Sure. And John, of course, what happened yesterday was viewed by hundreds of millions, if not billions of people worldwide. Both our allies and adversaries saw the United States, the Capitol building, the seat of our democracy, come to a major and very public crossroads. How do we rehabilitate that image? I mean, it's got to be shocking for people around the world who look to the U.S. as a beacon of democracy and see those images. It must be disheartening for them as well.
Well, it is. The role that America has played in the world stage has been under disruption for the last 4 years, as the president delivered on his promise to disrupt U.S. foreign policy and change it towards his vision. Foreign policy in general is in a kind of shaky place as a number of countries deal with some of the same things the United States is dealing with as those countries change and diversify. So it's always going to be a complicated situation. The way it gets fixed is basically, A, the passage of time, To the extent that the U.S. government functions and functions on the global stage along traditional patterns and lines, that will replace the feeling people have now. But then we also have to see how much of yesterday was the result of the idiosyncrasies of President Trump and how much of it was the result of political forces that are still in America. Is there still a market for grievance politics, the kinds of politics that President Trump practiced? Is there still a market for that? And therefore, will there still be flare-ups that are appealing to the kinds of people who were rioting yesterday, which will then have a continuing destabilizing force in American politics? You could also imagine the opposite, which is a great majority of Americans saying enough of this and creating some space for what we used to call bipartisan cooperation. We haven't seen it for a while. But perhaps this might be a hot stove moment. In other words, everybody touches the hot stove and decides, let's not do that again. And so this is, of course, the great challenge before Joe Biden as he begins at his inauguration, but then also as he decides to make the careful work of what his first gambits are going to be, and can he work with Republicans to build the kind of bipartisanship that will suggest to the world that America is back more or less on the rails.
It certainly feels as if we are at a significant crossroads. John Dickerson, thank you so much for sharing your insight with us. We appreciate it.